The forward operating base smelled of recycled air and stale coffee, a mix of fatigue that clung to every surface. The briefing room hummed with the restless chatter of pilots who had flown too many sorties in too few days. The projector cast a dull glow across the maps on the wall. Red corridors pulsing with threat indicators. Rachel Hayes sat near the edge of the room, notebook open, posture straight, eyes steady. Her silence was unremarkable to the others. They had grown used to her quiet presence, treating it as part of the furniture. The laughter carried over her shoulder as two younger pilots leaned back in their chairs. They joked that Hayes could probably recite the maintenance logs faster than she could throttle an engine. Another said she was too careful, too methodical, the kind of pilot who belonged behind a clipboard, not a stick. Their words rolled easily, not cruel enough to sting but sharp enough to dismiss. No one challenged them. They did not notice that her pen continued moving with deliberate rhythm, sketching not doodles, but precise notes that mirrored the map on the screen. Rachel had long since learned not to interrupt. The commanders preferred loud voices, the kind that filled silence with confidence whether or not it was earned. Her confidence lived in smaller rituals. She folded her worn checklist once, aligning the creases, as if order itself could anchor her against the noise. Her father's pen, still scratched from decades of use, sat clipped inside her sleeve. She did not need to look at it to know it was there. Its weight reminded her of evenings spent over flight charts, learning from him that precision was not weakness, but discipline. The air outside carried the metallic tang of jet fuel, drifting through the open door as the briefing dragged on. The base itself seemed to echo that same tired rhythm. Tires screeched on tarmac. A cart rattled past with spare parts. The desert wind pushed dust under the threshold, gathering in corners. Inside, the projector buzzed as the colonel pointed with a steel rod at the highlighted corridors. None of it was addressed to her. Her name remained near the bottom of the roster on the side screen. Another transport pilot assigned to routine cargo runs. When the briefing ended, the pilots rose in clumps, boots thudding against the metal floor. Rachel stayed seated a moment longer, closing her notebook carefully before sliding it under her arm. She walked out last, as she always did, the motif repeating itself in ways small and constant. Last on the list, last through the door, last to be remembered. Outside on the airstrip, the engines of fighters roared in impatient bursts while ground crews worked with hurried gestures. She paused at the edge. The smell of fuel heavy, the sun low and harsh. For a moment, the scene shimmered with the quiet truth she had long carried. Heroes often began in silence, unseen by those who measured worth only in noise. The command headquarters was lit by the harsh glow of overlapping screens, their grids and red arcs pulsing across the walls like veins of light. A countdown clock in the corner marked the time with unforgiving precision, 9 hours left. The name of Major Ashton Cole glowed in white at the center of the board, tied to a coordinate deep within enemy terrain. The silence in the room was heavy, but not because of clarity. It was the silence of indecision. Colonel Hughes stood at the front with his brass pen poised like a baton. He clicked it once, then again, the small sound tapping against the restless air. His voice was clipped and steady, reciting doctrine as though the words themselves could erase the danger. Risking aircraft for a single officer is outside protocol, he said, drawing a line across the map with his pen. Priority assets are committed elsewhere. We cannot scatter them chasing one man. The younger officers shifted uneasily in their chairs. They watched the red zones expand on the map, each corridor marked as contested. Hughes repeated that surface-to-air batteries covered the main approaches and that drone interference was escalating. His tone carried finality, but not conviction. The brass pen clicked again. Rachel Hayes sat 2 rows back, notebook balanced on her knee. Her posture was steady, eyes focused on the projected map, hand moving quietly as the others argued. She began tracing the outlines of the storm front, not with hesitation but with the certainty of someone who had studied the weather grids long before the briefing. A faint line curved where no official chart admitted passage. She marked it once, then left it unfinished. A fragment of possibility on paper. Lieutenant Carr noticed. His eyes flicked from the projection to her notebook, watching the silent line take shape. He said nothing, but his expression shifted, a small acknowledgement of curiosity among the noise. The debate swelled. One officer warned of political fallout if coal was abandoned. Another countered that sacrificing more lives would be worse. Hughes raised his hand, silencing them all. His pen now pressed flat against the board. He insisted that holding position and waiting for a clearer path was the only rational choice. The ticking clock on the wall disagreed. Every second shortened the window for extraction. Rachel did not raise her hand. She did not interrupt. She simply turned the page of her notebook and began marking elevations, small dots where interference weakened the radar field. The phantom line was taking shape, but no one asked her to explain it. She remained invisible, her work hidden beneath the shadow of rigid process. The meeting ended with no resolution, only instructions to reconvene in an hour. Officers filed out, voices low, urgency pressing but direction absent. Hughes lingered a moment longer, clicking his pen again before leaving. The room fell into silence, broken only by the clock counting down. Rachel closed her notebook, the faint line still unfinished, but alive in her memory. Rachel spread the new charts across her desk, the glow from the projector spilling faint red and blue across the paper. Storm fronts layered over the terrain like restless tides, each update rendering the region more impossible than the last. Official doctrine read the storm as a barrier, a wall of distortion that severed any chance of stealth approach. To Rachel, it looked like something else entirely. Her father's voice returned unbidden, calm and patient, reminding her of evenings long ago. As a child, she had sat at the kitchen table while he unfolded maps with creases so deep they barely held together. He would tap the lines with a calloused finger and say that wind carved channels just as water did. Rivers moved downhill, but air moved through pressure, folding itself into corridors. The charts will never tell you all of it, he had said, sliding a red pen across a blank margin to sketch invisible paths. You have to feel where the current would go if you were flying through it yourself. Rachel had traced those lines with her own small hand, learning that truth could live outside the borders of a map. Now, decades later, she leaned over the charts again, tracing with the same slow precision. The overlays showed anomalies where the storm bent unnaturally. To others, it looked like noise in the data. To Rachel, it was a rhythm. Bands of distortion folded back against one another, leaving a narrow corridor. It was not clean. It was not safe. But it was real. She drew it faintly, the curve bending across ridgelines no one else dared to mark. On her page, she labeled it the Phantom Line. When the officers reconvened in the command room, Rachel waited until Hughes finished another litany of reasons not to move. Then she spoke, her voice level and unhurried. She described the corridor and laid her chart flat against the projection. A few heads turned toward her, curiosity flickering before amusement replaced it. One captain chuckled that ghost paths belonged in campfire stories, not operational plans. Another muttered that cargo pilots had too much time for imagination. Laughter moved through the room, light but cutting. And Hughes dismissed her suggestion with a wave of his polished pen. Rachel did not argue. She simply pressed her notebook closed, the red mark still visible beneath the edge. Yet one person had not laughed. Lieutenant Carr leaned forward in his chair, eyes narrowing as if replaying the angles in his mind. He did not speak aloud, but his expression betrayed a flicker of recognition. The meeting pressed on, urgency reduced to procedure. The countdown clock glared in the corner. 8 hours remaining. Invisible lines ran across the wall map, unseen by most, but alive in Rachel's memory. She had learned as a child that not every truth earned belief on first telling. Some truths waited, patient as wind, until the world finally needed them. When the debate in the command room circled yet again, Rachel Hayes rose from her chair. She did not raise her voice, only said that she would take the mission. The room froze. For a moment, even the clock on the wall seemed to fall silent. Colonel Hughes's jaw tightened, as though the words themselves had offended him. His polished pen tapped once against the table, a metronome of disapproval. He began to remind her of her record, of the transport assignments that marked her place at the bottom of the roster. But the room had already shifted. Officers glanced at one another, surprised less by her offer than by the quiet certainty in which she had spoken it. Hughes finally gave his reluctant nod. His words were curt, laced with warning about the consequences of failure. Rachel did not answer. She only closed her notebook, slid it under her arm, and walked out with a steady gait. Behind her, whispers broke out. Some doubted she would even make it past the first bend of the storm. Others muttered that Hughes had let desperation drive reason aside. Yet no one offered to take her place. On the flight line, the A-10 Sentinel waited, its fuselage scarred from years of hard service. Under the arc of floodlights, ground crew swarmed the aircraft, bolting on extraction gear and checking the reinforced pylons. The air was sharp with the smell of fuel and metal, every sound carrying against the night. Rachel walked slowly around the plane, fingertips grazing the panels as though she were reacquainting herself with an old companion. The Sentinel had never cared for reputation. It only answered to the hands that flew it. She began her ritual of readiness, gloves pulled on with firm precision, visor lowered until the world narrowed into focused clarity, oxygen checks performed in silence, each motion exact, repeated until muscle memory confirmed it was right. She folded her worn checklist once more, tucking it neatly into the pocket where it always rested, aligned as if order itself could guard her from the chaos to come. There was no bravado, no swagger. Her preparation was measured, calm, and complete. Other pilots lingered nearby, their laughter subdued now but not absent. They whispered of superstition, of how she would vanish into the corridor without trace. Rachel ignored them. She leaned into the cockpit, fingers running over the switches, her father's pen a familiar weight under her sleeve. The engine's cold metal thrummed faintly, a heartbeat waiting to be awakened. When she stepped back down, the crew chief was waiting. His hands were stained with grease, his face lined from years of long nights on the line. He said nothing. Instead, he straightened, raised his hand in a crisp salute, and held it. It was not the salute of ceremony, but of recognition. Rachel returned it with a nod, a small acknowledgement between those who understood that readiness lived in details, not in words. As she climbed the ladder into the cockpit, the floodlights caught the curve of the aircraft, casting long shadows across the tarmac. She remained last on the roster, last in the order of respect, last to be called. Yet with the Sentinel alive beneath her and the storm corridor waiting ahead, that place no longer mattered. The rituals were complete. Doubt had been transformed into quiet resolve. The engines of the Sentinel roared against the night as Rachel Hayes pushed the throttles forward. She was the last to leave the ground. Her call sign acknowledged with little more than static over the comms. The others offered no encouragement, only routine acknowledgments that vanished quickly into the hum of their own assignments. She lifted from the runway with practiced steadiness, nose rising, gear folding in with clean precision. The base lights fell away, swallowed by the horizon. Ahead waited the storm corridor, a wall of interference that doctrine marked as impossible. She leveled out low, the kneeboard strapped to her thigh showing overlays she had drawn by hand. Across it ran the phantom line, faint in red ink, a current invisible to anyone who relied solely on radar. She adjusted trim and entered the edge of the storm. Immediately, the aircraft shook as turbulence gripped its frame. Lightning forked in the clouds above, turning the cockpit white for a breath before fading to black again. Her radar stuttered, screens blooming with echoes that ghosted and vanished before coordinates could lock. Her father's voice lived in memory, steady in her mind. Wind was a river. Air carved paths as water did, and pressure bent it into unseen channels. Do not fight the current. Drift with it until it delivers you clear. Rachel steadied her breathing, counting the seconds as she dipped to 100.0 meters above the ridgeline. The Sentinel quivered, caught in crosswind shear, but her hands stayed calm on the stick. For 6 minutes she flew blind. Instruments flickered uselessly, each scan buried in static. She trusted the rhythm she had memorized, nose tilting fractionally with each gust. Throttle eased when the winds rose against her. Heat blooms sparked faintly across her secondary display. Anomalies. Most would ignore. She traced them instead. Subtle markers of pressure bands that confirmed the corridor's edges. She whispered the count under her breath, her father's cadence guiding her. 6 minutes in darkness. 6 minutes until light returned. Far away in the mountains, Major Ashton Cole sat bound to a chair in a damp chamber. His broken wristwatch ticked faintly on his arm, the glass cracked but the hands still moving. Guards paced outside, their boots dragging on stone. He closed his eyes when he thought he heard a low thunder rolling over the peaks. Engines, faint but real. He strained against the ropes, listening harder, clinging to the fragile hope that someone had dared the impossible. The sound faded, replaced by wind. Yet he held to it. If there was thunder once, it could return again. Back in the cockpit, Rachel's vision narrowed. The phantom line bent sharply, third bloom marker flashing as interference swelled. She remembered her father's words, "Do not correct too fast. Let the storm bend you, not break you." She tilted the stick just enough to ride the curve, feeling the Sentinel slip along the unseen seam. Sweat pooled under her gloves, but her movements remained measured, precise. At last, the turbulence eased. Stars broke through the canopy above, clear against the black. Her radar blinked once, then steadied, confirming she had exited the shadow. She exhaled, a breath held too long. 6 minutes had passed. She unfolded her checklist, the red line drawn across it like a quiet signature. Proof that her father's corridor had lived beyond memory. She had flown the phantom line, unseen and unacknowledged, but alive. The valley narrowed into a black channel of stone as Rachel Hayes pushed the Sentinel lower, altitude holding steady at 900 feet. The ridgelines on either side erupted with radar sweeps, sharp pulses hammering against her instruments. Enemy locks blinked across the display, followed by the sudden arcs of tracer fire cutting up through the dark. She eased the stick left, then right, every movement deliberate, precise. Her father's words echoed through memory. Drift with the wind. Do not fight what you can ride. The first barrage tore the air where she had been seconds earlier. She skimmed the terrain, nose down, using the folds of the valley to break radar contact. The Sentinel shuddered as turbulence rolled in from crosswinds, but Rachel matched its rhythm, hands steady even as the frame vibrated. She pulled along the first bend, checking her kneeboard. The phantom line ran true, marked in red across paper no one else believed in. Ahead lay the extraction point, but it glowed under fire from every ridge. She opened the bay for the winch system. The hook line clattered free, metal glinting briefly before vanishing into the dark. On the ground, Ashton Cole staggered from cover, his body battered, half dragged by sheer willpower. Guards shouted behind him, muzzle flashes sparking. Rachel steadied the Sentinel over him, wings rocking under bursts of flak. She lowered the first lift. The cable swayed, but Ashton was not the one to catch it. Another survivor from the compound reached first, strapping in, body jerking as the winch strained. Rachel pulled him aboard, the sentinel bucking under renewed fire. She banked sharply, hugging the valley wall, then circled back. Second lift. Another figure clutched the hook, weight dragging the winch line until it groaned. She compensated with throttle, holding the frame level though alarms blared across her panel. Enemy fire stitched the airframe, sparks dancing from the right wing. But she did not flinch. Her eyes never left the rhythm of the gauges, and the storm bends ahead. One survivor hauled aboard. 2 out. The third bend loomed, the most dangerous point of the corridor. Her father's phrase returned with clarity. Drift with the wind. Do not fight it. She let the storm shove the sentinel into the curve rather than resisting, sliding along the current like a stone in a river. The aircraft held. She lined up for the final lift. On the ground, Ashton stumbled, nearly collapsing. His broken wristwatch still ticked faintly. Glass cracked, its sound swallowed by the chaos. He looked up as the cable dropped before him, tracer fire lacing the night. He forced his arms upward, fingers closing around the hook. Rachel steadied throttle, teeth clenched, watching his weight drag against the winch. Enemy fire slammed into the fuselage, one round tearing across the canopy's side. The sentinel groaned, alarms shrieking. Rachel did not break her focus. She held the nose level, throttle precise, until the winch motor locked Ashton into place. With the final lift secured, she yanked the sentinel into a climb, engines howling as she pushed back toward the phantom line. Flak erupted behind her, chasing, but the corridor bent again, hiding her in the folds of interference. The gauges steadied as she slipped into shadow. The airframe scarred but alive. Ashton's body sagged against the restraints in the bay, consciousness flickering, but his grip still locked around the hook, refusing to let go. Rachel glanced once at the kneeboard strapped to her thigh. 3 lifts. Final lift. The red line of the phantom marked beneath her father's handwriting. Strength had not come from force but from precision, timing, and memory carried in silence. The sentinel flew on, battered but steady, its pilot calm at the heart of fire. Rachel Hayes guided the sentinel out of the storm's edge, her hands steady on the controls though the aircraft's frame groaned with each vibration. Behind her in the bay, Ashton Cole was finally secured, straps pulled tight across his chest, his body slumped with exhaustion. He lifted his head weakly and managed to whisper, voice rasping from strain. "They'll never believe it was you." The words faded almost instantly under the drone of engines, but Rachel heard them clearly. She did not answer. She had never flown for belief. Back at command, the operations center was a chaos of broken signals. Radio bursts crackled through static, fractured words and coordinates stitched together by technicians leaning close to their headsets. On the central board, a faint transponder flickered where no official route existed. Hughes paced at the front, polished pen clicking in his hand as though the noise might reassert control. Each fragment of Rachel's transmission under fire contradicted his dismissal of the phantom line. He ordered restraint on comms, his voice sharp. Minimal transmissions. No celebration. She lands, and we move on. His rigidity was meant to contain the breach of protocol, but silence could not erase what the radar confirmed. Rachel flew low and steady, the scarred aircraft slipping back into known airspace. Her gauges steadied as the interference thinned, and soon the outlines of the base appeared through the canopy glass. She throttled back gently, letting the sentinel descend with measured control. Engines still loud but less furious now, like a beast easing into rest after strain. On the runway, personnel began to gather without orders. Mechanics, clerks, and pilots moved toward the line, drawn less by curiosity than by the sound of returning engines that should not have survived. They stood in silhouettes under the floodlights, watching as the battered craft rolled to a halt. The The Sentinel's fuselage bore fresh scars, its panels blackened and streaked. Proof of fire endured. Engines cooled with a long, sighing whine. The noise of battle faded into stillness. Rachel powered down systems one by one, each switch a ritual closing the arc of survival. She raised her canopy, the desert air washing in, carrying the faint tang of fuel and sand. Ashton climbed down first, supported by medics but upright enough to face the crowd. His uniform was torn, his face shadowed with exhaustion, but he paused before stepping aside. In full view of everyone gathered, he turned back toward the Sentinel. With deliberate clarity, he raised his hand in a salute to Rachel Hayes. It broke every expectation of protocol. A rescued officer saluting the overlooked pilot who had brought him back was a gesture none could ignore. The line of spectators remained silent, the weight of the moment pressing heavier than applause. A young airman at the edge of the crowd lifted a phone and filmed, the glow of the screen catching the reflection of scarred metal and the quiet exchange between survivor and pilot. No speech was made. No cheer erupted. But the truth was sealed in the act itself. Rachel sat in the cockpit a moment longer, helmet still in her lap, watching the figures on the tarmac blur through exhaustion, engines cooling, silhouettes waiting, the unspoken awe hanging in the air. Institutions might erase her from records, but memory had already passed to those who had witnessed. Recognition lived in silence, in a salute, and in the quiet certainty of return. The official logs were filed before dawn, cold lines of text stamped across the system. Rachel Hayes' sortie was marked as support, her contribution reduced to a single entry buried beneath layers of jargon. Colonel Hughes's commendation read as little more than acknowledgement of presence, the wording chosen to close the matter rather than open it. In the language of command, the phantom line did not exist, and the Sentinel's survival was folded into chance. What could not be erased, however, was the silence that lingered in the halls, the pause in conversation whenever her name was mentioned. Among the ground crew, a different record spread. The short video of Ashton Cole saluting from the runway moved quietly from one phone to another. Screens glowed faintly in barracks and offices, replaying the gesture with its weight intact. No captions were needed. Those who watched understood that something had shifted, even if the institution refused to say so. By midday, the cafeteria hummed with its usual rhythm. Metal trays clattered, chairs scraped across the floor, and tired voices carried in overlapping currents. Rachel sat at a corner table, her meal untouched for several minutes, the steam from her coffee rising in thin curls. Around her, the chatter continued as though nothing had changed. No one approached. No announcement was made. She had grown used to being invisible in such rooms, her place marked always at the edges. She picked up her fork at last, steady hands moving without rush. Across the room, a family visiting the base occupied a small table. A young girl tugged at her mother's sleeve, whispering with wide eyes. Rachel did not hear the words, but she saw the mother's glance, saw the quiet nod given in her direction. The girl's hand lifted briefly, pointing, before resting again against her mother's arm. Rachel felt a faint smile rise, unforced, quiet as the rest of her life had been. Proof no longer rested in commendations or rosters. It lived instead in memory, in the silent recognition of those who had seen or heard enough to understand. Unseen in the record, seen in the echo of a salute, and in the eyes of a child. She finished her meal without hurry, slid the tray forward, and stood. The low hum of conversation never broke, yet she carried with her a certainty stronger than any words filed in the logbook. Real legacy was not built in medals or citations. It was carried in the lives touched along the way, in the fragments remembered long after official pages had closed.